Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics from the American Civil War to the Korean War. Many listeners know the Monuments Men and Women, the Allied military personnel who protected cultural treasures during World War II and then aided in post-war restitution. Rose Valland, a French art historian at Paris's Jeu de Paume Museum, was not officially a monuments officer until May of 1945. Throughout the war, though, she courageously documented Nazi looting, tracked stolen artworks, and provided intelligence that proved crucial to the recovery of these items, helping to preserve, as a plaque in her honor at the Jeu de Paume puts it, some of the beauty of the world. In 2024, the Monuments Men and Women Foundation released the first English translation of her 1961 memoir, The Art Front, bringing her remarkable firsthand account to new audiences. Today, we are pleased to welcome Anna Bottinelli, president of the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, to the MacArthur Memorial podcast to discuss this project and Rose Valland's extraordinary service. So, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about Rose Valland, but also about this great project that was the Art Front.
Well, we are absolutely delighted to have you. Can you start us off by telling us about the Monuments Men and Women Foundation and what inspired this project to translate and publish the Art Front in English?
Sure. So the Monuments Men and Women Foundation was founded in 2007 by Robert Etzel. And the main objective was that of rediscovering the legacy of the Monuments Men and Women and making sure that this legacy would not be forgotten. Hard to believe now that Monuments Men is kind of an ubiquitous term, but back 20 years ago, very, very few knew about what was done to preserve cultural heritage in Europe during World War II. And that's because these men and women, when they were through protecting the art and returning it to the rightful owners, they kind of went back to their previous pre-war lives or tried to start some new lives, but didn't really talk about what they had done during the war. And so what they had done had largely been forgotten. The mission of the foundation throughout the years has grown and developed, but that core objective of preserving their legacy has always been at the forefront of everything we do. And to preserve the legacy of these heroes, the first step is to make accessible to everyone what they wrote, what they shared about their own experience. And Rose Valland had written about her years at the Jeu de Paume during the 4 years of Nazi occupation in Paris in her book Le Front de l'Art in 1961. But it existed still as of 4 years ago. 2 years ago, it existed only in French. And that wasn't accessible to everyone. And we thought it was a primary source that needed to be accessible worldwide and definitely to English speakers. And so that's how this idea originated.
Well, it was a wonderful idea. And I know that there were a number of us on our team that were absolutely delighted to have this in English. It has helped us in terms of our research tremendously. But what were the biggest challenges in bringing this translation to life, and what has the feedback been so far?
Well, I appreciate that your team found that useful, and I do think that primary sources just have a value that cannot be replaced, and it stands the test of times. There will always be books written about her, books written about World War II, but when you go back to those accounts by the people who lived through those years, for better or for worse, there is nothing that can replace their importance. Now, with this book, the challenge was, I think that the language was maybe the last of the challenges, especially nowadays with all of the tools of technology. Translating French to English is certainly not an insurmountable task. What was difficult with this project was giving Rose Valland's words the right context. When she wrote her book, many of the bad actors, the Nazis that she had been revolving around for 4 years, they were back in business. If they were art dealers, they were trading art again. But during those occupation years, they had threatened her. They had told her and the other French workers that were at the Jeu de Paume that Rose Valland supervised, they had tried to have them sign a paper where that prevented them from ever disclosing anything that they had witnessed in those years. She and the other workers never signed those papers, but of course, that was the environment she revolved around for years. And now, 20 years later, she comes out with a book that discusses the very things she was threatened to never share. So there was a lot of, I think, courage in writing her book, but also discomfort and personal fear in disclosing some details that were still very much raw and involved people that were very much alive. And as a result, her writing is quite dry at times, sarcastic, but also with lots of references that don't say things plainly, but you have to infer who she's talking about or what she's trying to say. And that is something that needed to be translated just as much as the actual language needed to be preserved. So the challenge, and why it took more than 2 years to really complete this translation, it was that there was this first layer of translation that involved language, but then there were so many different layers that involved it truly understanding what is she trying to say? Why is she not calling Hitler by first name and she's using some kind of paraphrase? Why sometimes there were references to historical elements of French costumes or culture that wouldn't translate to an international public. They would probably resonate with a French audience readership, but not with foreigners. So we wanted to make sure that if we couldn't amend the text in a way that was still faithful to her original text, but make it understandable, then we would need to supplement with footnotes that would give that additional context. So that, I would say, was the biggest challenge.
Well, as I said earlier, it's a very impressive product, and it's clear that a lot of work went into it. For visitors who are less familiar with Rose Valland, could you give a quick summary of her background and her role at the Jeu de Paume before the war?
Rose Valland was born in the southeastern part of France from a middle class working family. She was a sick child. She didn't enjoy a good health, but she was incredibly talented academically. And this served her well not only to overcome her health weakness, but especially to secure scholarships that allowed her to study at some of the most prestigious schools, such as the École des Beaux-Arts in Lyon, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the École du Louvre, the Sorbonne. And this gave her a very solid 10 years of academic learning and achievements. Now, despite that, she was refused a paid job at the Louvre. And so her first real job, although unpaid, was as an assistant to André Desarrois, who was the director of the National Museums for Contemporary Foreign Art in Paris, which was housed within the Jeu de Paume. That was in 1932. And then in 1936, she became a curatorial assistant within the Jeu de Paume, still unpaid. And then a couple of years later, when Desarrois became ill, Jacques Jojac, who at the time was the director of the National Museums in Paris, gave Rose the authority to operate the museum, still unpaid. It wasn't until 1941 that she got her first paid position. And so she was supplementing her income with some writing, some teaching, and brokering the purchase and sale of works of art. But she was very gifted and very determined.
Once Paris was occupied, how did her day-to-day role and responsibilities at the museum change?
Kurt von Baer, who was the head of the ERR in France, and I can go a little bit more into what the ERR was a little bit later. So the Kurt von Baer had requisitioned spaces at the German embassy, at the Louvre, to be used as storages for the art that was being confiscated. And then he went to Jacques Jaujard, the director of the National Museums, asking for more space. And he identified the Jeu de Paume as his the space he was interested in. Jacques Jaujard agreed to allowing them to use this space at the condition that they would keep a French curatorial staff member to draft the inventories. This staff member would have been Rose Valland. So Rose Valland's role on the outset was that of drafting these inventories of the art that was coming through the doors of the Jeu de Paume. Now, soon enough, the Germans did not like this idea anymore. They retained her within the Jeu de Paume, but they did not. They removed from her the responsibility of drafting the inventories. She justified the necessity to remain at the Jeu de Paume by explaining that there were mostly sculpture collections in the basement of the Jeu de Paume. There were the collections of the National Museum for Contemporary Foreign Art. They had been stored in the basement, and she needed to stay there at her post to be sure that their safekeeping would be guaranteed. So her role shifted. She was able to remain at her post, and then eventually started doing what she's probably most known for, and that you briefly addressed in your introduction, of recording the identities and the destinations of the work of art that were being processed. The Nazis were unaware that she understood German, and so she was trying to eavesdrop conversation and grasping any detail she could to then pass it on to Jacques Jaujard.
How was she perceived by the Nazis?
Well, she was modest and reserved in character. So she certainly projected an appearance of being unassuming and non-threatening. She dressed conservatively and plain. She was introverted. She revealed very little of herself. So she was, in a way, the perfect spy, because she really gave no reason to anybody to think much of her at all. The Nazis didn't particularly like her. I would say they tolerated her. But according to Valland, she was caught in the act of deciphering some addresses, but she was very able to make them believe that what they saw wasn't what they saw. So clearly she was very resourceful, very clever, very articulate, and very knowledgeable, to a point that she became necessary, but also as invisible as she could be. And that's what allowed her to do what she did for 4 years.
It seemed to me that she downplays a bit some of the danger that she's in. This seems like it was a very dangerous situation for her.
She certainly does downplay in her book at times. She does openly mention that she was scared. So I think that was interesting to read, because, of course, when we talk about her, or we think more of the heroic gestures that she did, but not necessarily of all of that was at stake. She was threatened with her life at least once. She knew that some of the highest ranking Nazis really did not like her and would have not thought twice about shooting her. So yes, she was definitely in danger. And I do think she was genuinely she feared for her life, but I also think her commitment to the preservation of the cultural heritage of France was such that really overcame, or helped her to overcome, this fear.
Absolutely. So, art professionals tend to maintain strong ties, even across borders or conflicts. And the Nazis, they bring in their own art experts. And Valland's opinion of them is rather nuanced, I think. How would you describe her attitude towards them?
I was impressed with how she was able to not generalize just because the Germans were the enemy, then make it all the Germans are bad. She was always very aware of those who were caught in this system and those that were just evil. And so when you talk about the art historians and the German art historians, there are examples of German art historians that she even looked up to. I'm thinking of Count Franz von Wolf Metternich. He was a German aristocrat who was an art historian and leader of the Kunstschutz, which was this branch, a German branch, if you will, the German Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section that was responsible for ensuring the protection of cultural heritage. And so Metternich was sent to France to ensure that the cultural heritage of France would be protected and preserved. And of course, that clashed with the looting that was taking place. And Rose Valland really admired him and showed unexpected support towards Metternich's actions. And more often than not, she would even solicit his opinion on certain matters of protection. So that would be one example in which between our historians, despite the parties they were in or the sides that they were on, there was this mutual respect. But then, of course, you have the other side of the medal, for instance, with Bruno Lose, also an art historian, but he was an SS member and Goering's personal art representative in Paris. He was one of the very few German art experts that spoke French. And they despised each other. Lose is the one that threatened, at least on one occasion, to shoot Rose Valland. According to her, she feared him and certainly did not look up to him in any way. He was extremely cunning and opportunistic. He was taking advantage of situations for personal benefit. So I would say that's the environment and the feelings that were going at the time through the Jeu de Paume. There was a lot of conflict even within experts of the same trade, but Rose Valland always had a very clear distinction between who was an ally in a very broad sense of the term and who wasn't.
You mentioned some conflict, and I thought this was very interesting in her book because I think at least here in the States in school, we often learn that the Nazis are ruthlessly efficient and, everybody's on side and they're all working towards one goal. But her memoir reveals that there are plenty of internal rivalries. There's lots of chaos among the different kind of looting organizations, I guess we could call them. Could you summarize the key rivalries that she lays out? And do you think that these rivalries meaningfully hampered the Nazi effort to take some of this art?
Well, I don't think they hampered the efforts. They may have complicated things at times. They may have made them messy. They may have maybe slowed them down some. But I think this evolution from an improvised campaign of looting of the early occupation days to a systematic looting on a massive, unprecedented scale, that happened and happened regardless, as we know. So I don't think the conflicts themselves interfered. However, as we see it these days as well, when you have personalities that are really strong and driven not by a common goal, but by a personal enrichment and personal agenda, sooner or later, those conflicts will happen. It's just a matter of time, because at some point, someone will want to prevail over the other. And that's what was happening within this looting agencies, these looting efforts, that there were too many people that were trying to benefit their own agenda. And you asked for a couple of examples. I'm thinking, for instance, within the ERR, we have a conflict between Alfred Rosenberg, who was the leader of the ERR. The ERR, I mentioned it now a few times, was this body, the Eisenstaats Reichsleiter Rosenberg, led by Alfred Rosenberg, who was giving legitimacy and a structure to the systematic looting. And Rosenberg himself was really trying to give authority to the looting and fit it within the Nazis' ideology. But then you have Goering, who at the same time is coming to the Jeu de Paume on his shopping afternoons, where he's looking at the art and he wants to enrich his own collection. And that is interfering with this strong sense of legitimacy that Rosenberg is trying to infer. And so that was one of the conflicts that Rose Valland talks about and that you can see in the history of this of this topic that really creates strong friction between the parties. Another one is within the German embassy, the German foreign minister von Ribbentrop ordered Otto Abetz, who later became the German ambassador to France, to expropriate the private collections of Jews and other enemies of the Reich. And this was aligned with a decree from Hitler ordering private collections in France to be placed under German control. And Abetz targeted some of the most prominent names, the Rothschild, Rosenbergs, that were a different Rosenberg. We have Rosenbergs on both sides which creates some confusion. But the Seligman, the Wildenstein, Kanz, Bernheim, Jun, and these early seizures were improvised and less systematic, and they were driven largely by Abetz's personal zeal. And so this encounters resistance from the German military administration, and the Kunstschutz that I mentioned earlier was tasked with preserving this the art in France. And this short-lived confiscation campaign by Abetz was inevitably absorbed under the ERR because it wasn't being managed the way it needed.
So you brought up this idea of there's a lot of kind of strong personalities, there's a lot of individual interests, and that brings me to the next question. So I think people always wonder, what was the main motivation for the Nazis? Why were they stealing all of this cultural property? And we have justifications that range from, they are trying to reclaim stolen works, things Napoleon took, or, things like that. Or, Hitler wants to build this special art museum, this cultural capital. They want to control culture. In some respects, they want to fund the war through art sales. But Valland offers, I think, a very sharp insight that the looting shouldn't be seen as merely a state operation, and this is a quote, Nazi methods have always tried to disguise individual ambitions behind general interests. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's a great quote. And she sarcastically writes, and I'm not quoting, but I think I'm close enough, that there was no selfless crusade in the Third Reich, meaning that nobody was really doing this out of goodness or for some greater objective and ideal, but rather there were a lot of personal agendas that were being carried out at the same time. Well, let me rewind just a little bit to how did this, because when we think of war, we think of weapons, and we think of violence, and we think of destruction. We don't necessarily think of stealing art. So when Hitler went on his first state visit to Italy in 1938, he visited Naples, Rome, and then Florence. When he was in Florence, he was mostly excited about visiting Florence, not because he was with his ally, Il Duce Mussolini, but because he was going to walk through the Pitti Palace and the Uffizi Galleries, the main museums in Florence. Hitler was considered himself an artist, and he thought really highly of his artistic talents, and was really offended by the fact that the Academy in Vienna rejected his application. So as he was walking through the hallways of the Uffizi, which is filled with masterpieces collected by the Medici family across centuries, he thought that's where the idea of his own museum really started. He thought if the Medici were able to amass such an outstanding collection back in the days, what prevented him from doing the same? And that's when this idea was born. And so he went back to Linz and started planning the rebuilding of his hometown. And at the center of it, he would have wanted this art center, future museum that would have been filled with the best art that, in his mind, Western civilization had ever created. Now, Hitler had a very specific taste of what he considered the best art. It might not necessarily be what we today consider the best art, but he was particularly enamored of the German Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance as well, German first and foremost. And there was only a problem that the Medici didn't have, but that Hitler had. The works that he wanted, they were already in museums. They were already in collections. And so the only way for him to create this museum was to go and get the art he wanted. And by get, I mean take, steal. So, of course, that was his agenda. His agenda, Hitler's agenda, was that of creating his museum. But he was very selective. And like I said, he had a very peculiar taste. So it wasn't to be just a random mass of artworks without a plan and without some sort of curatorial eye, if you will. But then you have other agendas. There is Goering, who wants to enlarge his collection, but he's fueled by greed and hubris. He has no understanding of art. He collected forgeries, not knowing he was purchasing forgeries. So he's more for the quantity rather than the quality. Then you have Rosenberg's agenda, who, like I said, he was the chief Nazi racial theorist, and he sought institutional legitimization. And so he wanted to he was framing his personal ambitions within the Nazi ideology and within Hitler's vision. And then you have Ribbentrop, for example, who viewed the plundering of France as a diplomatic tool that could be used for political leverage. So you see, there are so many that the outcome is the same. All of these collections are being dismembered, taken away, and separated. But what's driving this? It's so many different objectives from within the Nazi Party itself.
That was a great way to lay all that out. Moving forward a little bit in the timeline, it's August 1944. Paris is being liberated. And in her memoirs, Valland makes it clear that even liberation poses a threat to some of the art that she and her colleagues are trying to protect at the museum. After the fighting ends, she does not immediately share all the information she has about the other items that have passed through the museum with the Allies. And I think some of our listeners might want to know, why did she delay? And then a follow-up, why is she later accused of being unpatriotic for ultimately providing that information to the Americans?
Well, the delay is easy to explain if we put ourselves in the French perspective. So imagine that they had endured 4 years under occupation of the German military administration, and then they see it replaced by the military presence of the Allies. How would they know that the Allies are really good? After 4 years of it's just a change of the guard, if you will, but it would take time to ensure that the Allies were the actual liberators, and that is something you cannot rush. It's something that has its own course, and that actions speak for themselves. She also didn't know who to trust. There were so many examples towards the end of the war, or closer to the liberation of Paris and France. There were so many examples of French collaborating with the Nazis. You get to a point that you kind of do whatever it takes to stay alive. And so Valland could trust Joujard. She could trust maybe a handful of other people, but beyond that, she didn't trust anybody. And so even when Monuments Men, Lieutenant James Rorimer, reached Paris, and he's tasked with meeting Rose Valland and discussing the subject with Rose Valland and trying to get information out of her, it will take some time for him to earn his trust, because she's obviously skeptical. Now, on your second part of the question, I love that question because I think it reminds us to give context to actions and not fall in the trap of analyzing something that happened in the past with what we know in the present and all of the knowledge that has been acquired since. So the unpatriotic was due to the fact that when Rose Valland finally trusted the Allies and trusted Rorimer, she decided to bypass bureaucracy to avoid delays and to avoid issues, and to hand directly to Rorimer the information she had gathered. That is one of the reasons she was considered unpatriotic, is because she handled directly to the Allies bypassing the bureaucratic steps. Now, another reason she was sometimes deemed unpatriotic is because during post-war France, there was a purge of Nazi collaborators, and Valland's espionage was known only to a few individuals, like I said, Jojard and a few others, but to the rest of Paris, if you will, she had been within the Nazi circle for 4 years. She was within the Jeu de Paume with them. How did the rest of everybody else, how would they know that she was spying and that she was actually aiding France as opposed to aiding the looting efforts by the Nazis? And this is why I mentioned putting ourselves back in those years, and now with all of the knowledge that we have, now we know what she was doing. At the time, nobody did. And so, of course, even her own people were really skeptical of her role, and of course did not trust her and thought she was a collaborator.
A very complicated situation, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
She is commissioned as a monuments officer in the French army in May of 1945. Can you share some of the highlights of this service?
Yeah, her post-war service is probably just as remarkable as what she did during the occupation, maybe less life-threatening, but certainly, yes, just as remarkable. So she remained a dauntless advocate for the return of looted French-owned art, and did so in various ways and various positions. So after the liberation in November 44, she established it was established within the Jeu de Paume, the Commission for Art Recovery, and Valland was its secretary. That wasn't enough for her, so she was really eager to get into Germany and make sure that the information she had shared was being used at its best, and that hideouts where all of this art had been hidden. And maybe for the listeners that may be less familiar with this story, the art that was being confiscated and stolen and taken through the doors of the Jeu de Paume was then loaded on trains and trucks and brought into Germany and Austria and hidden in castles and mines and other hideouts, waiting for the end of the war that, of course, the Germans thought they would have won. And then at that point, they would have taken the art out of these repositories and placed it wherever they had envisioned. So what Rose Valland was keeping track of in her secret notes was not just the identities of the paintings, which family or place collection they were coming from, but also where they were going. And that was an extremely important piece of the puzzle, of course, to allow the Allies that were closing on Germany and closing on Berlin as they were coming across these areas where supposedly the art had been stored, to then actually go and look for it. Rose Valland didn't know that this was being done. She had passed on all of this information, but had no confirmation that all of these hiding places were being discovered. So she was itching to be there herself. And so it's actually an interesting little story. She made it to the castle of Neuschwanstein. The castle of Neuschwanstein is this castle in Bavaria, not too far from Salzburg, which is actually what inspired the Walt Disney castle as we know it today. And Rorimer had already been there. That's where they found thousands and thousands of the objects and works of art stolen from some of the most prominent French collectors. And after Rorimer left, he had put an off-limit sign on the door and instructed the guards to not let anybody in. He was concerned that someone would go in and walk away with a painting before they had a chance to inventory and begin the restitution process. But so Rose Valland gets there at the castle that she knew had written the roadmap to find it, and she was turned away. The guards were doing their job, and of course that was quickly fixed, but not even her was able to access those premises. Anyways, as you mentioned, yes, she did enlist in the French First Army, received her commission in May 45 as a lieutenant. Soon she was promoted to captain. And with that, she worked at the collecting points for several years, aiding the other monuments men and women in the identification of the works of art that belonged to France. The collecting points were 4 hubs if you will, that had been established by the monuments, but by the Allies, to take in all of this thousands and thousands, actually 5 million objects that in the final months of the war, they had been discovered and safeguarded, to begin the process of inventorying, cataloging, and then returning them eventually to the countries they had been taken from.
It seems like it was a very fulfilling time in her life to be part of all that.
Yeah, she worked closely with some of the most prominent monuments men and women. We see her in photos at these collecting points all the time, and I think, having been an advocate for art, but having risked her life to preserve this art, I can imagine it was indeed a very fulfilling feeling to finally see this art saved.
What do you see as her lasting legacy?
Well, interestingly, the France didn't really recognize her for decades. There are accounts that tell how at her funeral there were but a handful of people. The marble plaque that you mentioned in your introduction, that's now on the side of the Jeu de Paume, that was not put there until 2005, if I'm not wrong. So her lasting legacy is really something that we have rediscovered in the last decade or so. And I do think is no doubt thanks to the efforts of the foundation, the books by Robert Etzel, the movie, The Monuments Men, of course, that although it's Hollywood, it does allow the general public to become familiar, at least in a very broad way, with what Rose Valland's character, Claire Simon in the movie, did during World War II. So she's now not only known, she's definitely admired and held as an example of a hero of the arts. The fact that she's a woman, I think it's an important element as well, because there are strong women in history that provide great examples, but of course there are fewer than the men. And so we often gravitate towards these men examples, but having a woman that stands out, it can inspire a broader, I think, group of people that may sometimes not find a connection with the more traditional hero, especially during warfare that is a heavily men-dominated affair. World War II, those were the laws at the time, so it just wasn't possible for a woman to bear arms. But I think the lasting legacy really is not just what she did, but is what she represents. I see her as this quiet force against evil, someone that's working towards a bigger goal, and a value that transcends our mortal being. I really admire her dedication to the arts with the uppercase A, if you will. And her life really demonstrated more than her words. And I believe very much that facts matter, actions matter, not just what you say, but what you do. And she didn't say much and did so much. And that I find it really inspiring. And I think that is ultimately what will really live of her.
Wonderfully put. And I think we owe her a great debt of gratitude. And whenever I think about World War II, I think we always tend to think, well, the Allies won. You know, we have the benefit of hindsight. We know that a victory is coming. It will be a difficult fight, but the victory will be won. But I can't imagine that victory with the loss of all of this art. You know, if there had not been the Monuments Men, if there had not been people like Rose Valland helping to save, track, tell the story of what was happening, I wonder if the Allied victory in World War II would have been a Pyrrhic victory at too much of a cost in some respects.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I completely agree.
Any final thoughts?
The Art Front is a great book. It's a great book not because it's a gripping read, but because it really transports you back to a complicated time. And I think we have the benefit of knowing how things end, just like you just finished saying. We know that the outcome is going to be a great one. So you can enjoy the struggle without being tormented by it, if you will, because you know that what she's going through is going to pay off. And it's not going to pay off in the short term. It's going to pay off for the rest of humanity. We all plan our, I don't know, our spring breaks. Now I'm overseas, and you think, oh, of course, I want to go to the Louvre. Well, the Louvre would have looked a lot different, was it not, for Rose Valland or other museums across France as well as across Europe. So I think with all of this knowledge of today, reading her words, her own story, her own struggle, but also learning more about who she was through her writing. She's extremely sarcastic in such a smart way that it's just such intelligent writing. The references are so you can really see her academic training. They're really academic references, learned references that sometimes we had to do some studying ourselves to know what she was talking about. And of course, she was always right. But I do think it's a fundamental primary resource in the understanding of the looting that took place during World War II, especially in France, but also to understand the dynamics between all of these Nazi leaders and art historians and the government officials, and how complicated the interactions were. So it's really a snapshot, if you will, of 4 years of occupation seen from within. And I find it really just an incredible opportunity to learn something from a different perspective.
If listeners want to learn more about the foundation or where they can purchase a copy of The Art Front, where should they go?
The book is available on the foundation's website. We have an online store on www.mmwf.org, but it's also available on Amazon. We made that mostly for our international followers and international readers. It's easier to purchase it on Amazon for overseas shipping as opposed to through us, just because of duties and shipping fees. So I love to encourage people to purchase directly from us if they're in the US, because they support our mission. Every purchase on our online store goes towards our mission, which now has evolved to continuing to find the art that has not been returned after World War II and return it to the rightful owners. But international readers, if they want, it is easier to just find it on Amazon. And otherwise, I invite anybody to check out our website. Like I said, www.mmwf.org, and learn about our mission at large and the project we're involved. We have another project that I hope we will announce in the next few months. I'm really excited about. I cannot say more, but it's something that aligns very well with what we did with Rose Valland. So we're continuing in this path of honoring the legacy of the Monuments Men by making their words accessible. So that's something I'm looking forward to.
Very exciting. We will look forward to hearing about that too. Well, Anna, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. That was really very interesting. And we wish you and the Monuments Men and Women Foundation all the best. And again, we look forward to the next projects.
Well, thank you again, Amanda. I really enjoyed talking about this book with you. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov, or find us on X at MacArthur1880, or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.